you dream of a classroom where learning is natural? Can we inspire students to lifelong learning? What exactly is the purpose of an education? Inspiring students to be curious, independent, creative, innovative, deep thinking, confident, proactive, collaborative, determined, educated. Rise to the challenge of changing the world. This is teaching. This is learning. This is who we are. Welcome to the Tabletop Inventing Podcast.
Have you ever wondered what it's like to work at Google? Does Google really have a climbing wall at the office? And how important is practical programming experience if you want to work at Google? Join us today as we pick the brain of a Googler. Today in the Tabletop Inventing Podcast, we're talking to a Googler, someone who works for Google. If you're curious about some of the things you've read about Google, their employees, and the amenities at the office, stay tuned. On the interview, Eric and I had such a great conversation that we went over our interview time. So we added some bonus footage at the end of this episode, so don't miss it. After college, Eric Hennigan worked for the U.S. Navy as a programmer. That experience convinced him to sharpen his skills as a programmer, and he went back for a PhD in computer science from UC Irvine. Along the way, he discovered the best students are actually self-taught. Eric has worked at several companies as a programmer, including Zodiac Aerospace, but currently he's a coder for Google. He doesn't say much about his duties as a YouTube ad wrangler, but his views on getting a great education are priceless. My guest today is Eric Hennigan. Eric has a PhD in computer science from UC Irvine, and before that he got a degree in physics and math from UCLA. And currently he is working for Google, and if you have ever been watching a YouTube video and one of those weird ads shows up, Eric has something to do with that. We might ask him what he has to do with that, and he may tell us or may not be able to tell us. We'll find out. He says that his favorite accomplishment in life is actually that he made it to Google because they feed him. And that doesn't seem like that would be a big deal if you like to cook, but Eric really doesn't like to cook. And in fact, given the choice between having to make something to eat or not eating, he would more likely not eat. So the fact that Google feeds him is good, and it makes him a good software programmer where he is because he doesn't have to think about that. So Eric, tell us more about working at Google. What's that like?
Well, the people there are really friendly. The office has a lot of perks. And it's not even the Mountain View campus where they have like swimming pools and stuff. So this is a satellite office in Venice Beach. And they have like a climbing wall and a quarter basketball court and a courtyard and an on-site gym and an on-site masseuse. Although the massages aren't free, you got to pay for those.
So you said climbing wall. Do you climb?
The climbing wall at that office is more of a bouldering wall. I was every day using it for about a half an hour.
That is cool, because I actually like bouldering and climbing. So how did you end up at Google?
So I was getting my PhD a few years ago. In the last year of doing that, I found another job because I needed some money because the grant had run out. So I found a job, and I was working for Zodiac Aerospace, testing their equipment. They make the little TVs in the back of the airplane seats that you watch movies on.
Oh.
And so I was writing test software for them. And after about a year and a half of that, a Google recruiter reached out to me on LinkedIn.
Interesting.
So I got the job because a Google recruiter found me interesting.
So let's back up a little bit, because I'm always curious how people end up where they are. And Google sounds like a really cool place to work. But let's go back really, really far. How about grade school? What do you remember about being in, I don't know, third or fourth grade?
I remember they had a small room where they had a bunch of new computers. At the time, it was Apple machines. And I remember a couple years after that, Oregon Trail. And I remember in sixth grade, there was a GATE program where you could play with computers. And they weren't shiny new Apple machines. They were old machines with the really 5 1/4 inch floppy disks. But that was all fun stuff to play with. And I do remember even at that age, I found the computers very interesting. They tried to teach us something like Logo with the little turtle, and you
Yeah.
write a little program to move
Yeah.
it around. And I remember really enjoying that. And I remember the teacher was a little bit confused as to what it was doing.
Well, actually, we know some people who would be very excited that you mentioned the word logo, because that was actually quite an important program in the computer learning and
Yeah.
the tech ed space, actually. But I was curious that the teacher wasn't very comfortable. But did you learn even though he wasn't very comfortable, or she wasn't very comfortable with that?
Oh yeah. So it's very, very difficult if you have 20 or 30 students that are of grade school age and you put them in front of a computer and they can do stuff. So I was playing around a lot, but in reality, the playing around was exploring what the system can do, and it's really educative. So the fact that she wasn't able, because of the number of students, to give me an exact script allowed me to explore some things that weren't on the script. And I think that's incredibly useful. It looks like play, but it's learning.
All right. So, and that was up through what, like 5th, 6th grade?
Yeah.
So what was middle school and high school like for you?
So middle school, I do not recall in middle school that they had a set room full of computers or anything like that. The grade school definitely had it. Thinking back now, they definitely had it because of some federal grant funding or something as part of the program. The middle school didn't have that. I remember it being kind of small and then branching out in some trailers. And I got pushed ahead and I was able to learn algebra in 8th grade and then move on to high school. And the high school building was really pretty old, built in the 50s. And I shared some of the teachers in middle school and high school that my own mother had. Yeah. So it's a small town. That happens. The teacher's there for a very long time, and they teach both generations, kind of.
So when you think back to your grade school and middle school and high school experience, was there a time in there when you discovered that you enjoyed learning, or, well, did you even think like that? Was that a...
Well, I kind of thought of it as a prison. But I didn't have the words to express that at the time. So I remember being mostly incredibly bored with all of the classes and just doing mostly the minimum, except for the math classes. I really liked the math classes, and I didn't have to try hard at them. And they were really boring because I could get the lesson in 5 minutes what they spent the whole hour on.
So what did you do outside of school? Was there anything that you did outside of school that kind of fed your need for learning, or were you kind of the typical go?
I remember not doing very much. So at that time, this is before the internet. So my grandparents had purchased us a computer that they were really wealthy grandparents, and I could play around on it, but there wasn't a lot to do except like play video games on it because it didn't have the internet. There wasn't a lot to explore. It's whatever it came with, basically.
So where did the interest in computers develop for you? Was it there in grade school, or was it later?
I remember my interest. Well, I definitely had an interest in grade school with the GATE program and being able to do things there. And that was fairly unstructured. But I don't remember a really strong interest until high school. So I had these earlier interests, but there wasn't any way that they could have been fed until high school.
So what did you do in high school that started to feed that interest?
So in high school, I was in high school up until 2000, and the World Wide Web kind of got a good start in 94 through 96. So then I could stay late in the high school after hours and fiddle around on the computers there, and really liked that. So I was able to surf the net and read a bunch of stuff.
So did you find yourself becoming less bored with being at school?
Yes. Well, because finally I'm allowed to do some more self-directed stuff, and that's far, far less boring than being talked at.
So if I could read between the lines a little bit, it sounds like as you went through school that it didn't feel particularly relevant. You weren't very challenged, and the result was that you were bored and it felt like a prison. But somehow when you had knowledge at your fingertips again, or maybe, I don't know if again is the right word, but when in high school when that occurred, that suddenly you felt like there was a lot more meaning and interest and purpose in the whole learning process.
Oh, yes, and without any goal in mind. So I didn't have the idea that I would one day grow up and work for Google. I had no idea what was going to happen in my life in 5 years from then. But I really just, at that moment, liked being able to surf the net and read about things. And I even fiddled around with Linux. I really begged my grandmother to buy another computer, an updated one, and get an internet connection, and played around with that, and had a good experience learning from it. Even though, and my whole family realized I was just addicted to the machine. Because there wasn't a time where I wouldn't be on it. So I completely monopolized it, but I'm still addicted to these machines. They're wonderful.
So what kind of stuff did you do? I mean, there in high school, so you were surfing the web. What kinds of stuff were you looking for?
I remember reading the Anarchist Cookbook.
I'm not sure we should recommend that on the podcast.
I was interested in those kinds of things. So at the time I was kind of interested in explosive materials and that kind of stuff. I never ended up building a weapon.
I should clarify here. Both Eric and I had an opportunity to work together a few years ago at a Navy base here in California. And one of the things that was a big deal at the Navy base was they actually had a big test range, and a lot of the people that we knew in the town actually worked in the test range, blowing things up. And so,
and they'd explode stuff that was like old and sitting around and now hazardous.
Yeah, and so it was actually kind of a normal part of the culture for kids to think about, blowing things up and exploding things. And I think in the whole time I was there for, 10 years, I think we had one scare from someone who was collecting something in their backyard that they shouldn't. But in general, these are people who are researchers trying to understand, explosives and,
right.
Use them for interesting engineering purposes, But so as a teenager growing up in an environment like that, it was probably pretty natural to look at that. Although,
well, I never had any intention of blowing something up at a school. My whole intention was to get something that would make a nice explosion and then take it out to the unoccupied desert and watch it go bang.
Well, I think we get nervous in the educational system when we think about things that are dangerous, partly because we have a legal system that puts us in a position of having to worry about stuff like that. Someone can sue you because, as a school, you didn't catch that student that was, thinking in the wrong direction. And, we now have whatever insurgents or whatever you want to call it, here in the U.S. We worry about like terrorist acts and all of these things. But I remember as a kid, one of the most spectacular things that I ever did was I collected a bunch of fireworks and I kept dumping the gunpowder out into a 35 millimeter film canister. and I remember I thought, it'd be easy to fill up a 35 millimeter film canister, but it turns out those explosives, fireworks and stuff have almost no gunpowder in them.
Oh, there are a lot of packaging.
And, and I think it took me a year and a half to fill that thing up a third from, getting things from 4th of July and New Year's, and, because I wasn't like telling people to buy fireworks, and I wasn't like telling my mom I was doing this. And I remember one day, I finally got tired of waiting. I thought, well, what would happen if I just lit that whole thing on fire? So I took it out to the yard and, stood it up in the driveway and dropped a match in it, and it shot a flame out about 4 or 5 feet. And I thought that was spectacular and laughed hysterically, and then realized that, a year and a half of collecting was gone. But I think kids have always been interested in that idea of, something exploding or something, dropping or flying or, these far out things you always see on television.
Oh, really dynamic animated stuff, yeah. And they make really good chemistry demonstrations.
So were you looking up like chemistry of how these things work? Because I kind of got sidetracked there.
I did look up some of that, but I was looking up mostly how to assemble them. And of course I didn't have the materials available.
So what other kinds of things were you looking up?
I played StarCraft a bunch. It was a video game. They have a new one out recently, StarCraft 2. But after high school, I actually completely lost interest in video games. They just seem sort of boring and routine.
So that's interesting because we normally think of someone who's a software engineer, computer scientist, being very interested in computers, and sometimes they're interested in video games and sometimes not. But what was it about the video game that was interesting at the time, and what became boring about it?
At the time, it was gameplay, and a lot of it was hanging out with friends to do group battles online or on a local network. And then after high school, I just got friends went off to college, so we kind of split up. That's a normal occurrence. And then I didn't really make very good, strong friends when I got to college. But even if I had, video games wouldn't have been a primary interest of mine anymore. I just reached an age point where I saw the games as not accomplishing much. And I'd much rather have been reading a book about something or pursuing some other interest.
So I think a lot of parents, we spend time as parents. I have teenagers, so I spend time thinking about this. I watch my teenagers playing video games, and I wonder, what's happening inside the mind of my teenagers. They play video games, and the picture that comes to mind, the worrisome picture is the 30-year-old teenager sitting on your couch playing video games. Then that kind of bothers, parents when they think about, they project ahead and they get that sort of fear response about the video games. What would you tell parents about video games and teens in that sort of space?
So that's a thing that can happen, and I'm not sure what's behind it. So it could be that there's some kind of addictive behavior with the video game and its gameplay, and they just get sucked into that, and they never grow to be interested in anything else. And it can be maybe they're using it as an escape. That is, they're afraid to be interested in anything else.
So do you have friends that fell into both of those categories? The one where you played for a while in high school and then you got out and did other cool things with computers, and then those who kind of got sucked into the video game?
Well, all the people I work with, a lot of them still do play video games, but it is just an entertainment for them. It's not a real focus of their life. So
is that in general kind of a passing phase then, you think?
It might be, yeah. So but little kids, like grade school and whatnot, they're very interested in playing games, and they're actually learning a whole lot when they're doing the gameplay. They're learning some strategy, they're learning interaction with other people, and then eventually you just grow out of it because you get old.
I think I object to that.
Well,
I like playing video games.
Right, and then when you're 30 and you have kids of your own, you can play the video games with your kids.
So let's take a turn here, because one of the things that I wanted to do is talk a little bit about your philosophy of thinking and learning. So maybe we'll jump into our two questions a little early. I've been interested to ask this question, and it's curious because I have a Googler here now, and I can ask this question, because one of the things I usually ask is, in the digital age with Google and Wikipedia and YouTube, you can learn just about anything. And it sounds like you were that kid, and now you work at Google. So what does it mean in that environment today with all these tools? What does that mean to be educated?
Unfortunately, in the business environment, being educated means you hold some kind of paper certificate. But I personally don't. I have this paper certificate, and I don't put a lot of stock into it, because I think it's really kind of, you sat in a chair for a long time and got lectured at and passed a few quizzes and tests. And that doesn't mean you can do the work that a business wants you to do. It doesn't mean that you can apply the knowledge that you learned. And there's a lot of stuff that you do as a software engineer, and I'm sure other fields, that's just practitioner's knowledge. And if the teacher says it or not, it doesn't mean anything to a student, because they just haven't gone through the experience of running into the trouble that real practitioners have run into. And because they ran into it, now they care about some solution for that problem. So I remember in my growth that after college, I got a job working for the Navy. And I started writing software for them. And I wrote a program that was about 12,000 lines long. And it took a while, right? It's a few months labor. But I remember hitting about the 10,000 mark and realizing that that my habits, my approaches, the way I was going about writing the software wasn't scaling. So there were things that I had written and I forgot how they worked. And I wasn't being as consistent about solving problems as I could have been. Because, well, hell, I was just out of college, right? And all throughout college, your biggest program is going to be like 2,000 lines. Well, there's a big difference between the habits you can use to solve a program that's a couple thousand. A smart person could reasonably keep the entire thing in their head at the same time, and it doesn't matter if it has some holes in it. But at 10,000 lines, you can't keep it all in your head, and you really have to start writing it differently. And then in the business world, you're often working on programs that are 30,000 lines plus, if not 100,000, and you didn't write those lines. A lot of other people did. And so now you have to approach how are you going to make changes there completely differently. And none of that is even capturable in the education system, which to me makes the system kind of a joke. It's a lot. You can learn a lot more just by doing an internship. And Google, Microsoft, all these companies, they have really good internship programs.
Well, what about like a hybrid idea? I mean, I'm just talking off the cuff here. I mean, what if an education looked like you working at, Google for, I don't know, 20 hours a week or 24 hours a week, and then taking classes, to fill up part of the other time, and that you picked classes based on problems you were trying to solve in your job?
Oh, I think that works really well. So I know on my job I have consistently been able to learn more material just by surfing the internet and looking for answers to the problem I was facing. Stack Overflow is wonderful. It didn't exist when I started working, and it's completely awesome. I no longer use it now that I'm at Google because we have our own internal code search program. But when I was working at my previous company, I was on Stack Overflow a couple times a day, searching for how do I get such and such to work so and so, and it's great because you just pick up whatever little tidbit you need, and if you're well practiced, you already know your approach, and you're just using the internet to fill in the details. So the internet's great for that kind of superficial research, and it's also really good. If you run into a problem, you're able to find at least a sequence of links to find somebody who has named that problem and maybe a wiki page or something discussing it.
Maybe this is a different kind of question, because I thought a little bit about the knowledge that you see on sites like Stack Overflow, or like the Google internal code search, etc., versus a carefully thought out hierarchical approach to a particular subject that you would get maybe in a class in college. Does it organize the information differently, and is that useful in some situations?
So it's the internet's definitely not as organized as a classroom would be. That's certainly true, because the instructor presumably has taken a lot of care in selecting a specific ordering of things and how they're going to go through, and the later things build on the earlier things. And the internet has none of this. You just come into an article and you read it, and sometimes you don't understand it. So I do remember early in my career I was programming, and there was a concept I wasn't familiar with, which is allocating memory on the stack versus the heap. This is a very, very fundamentally important thing if you're dealing with languages like C and C++. And I was using those languages for a couple of years and didn't know the difference. And every time I looked up stack and heap, I'd get these data structures that do not explain the problem at all. It's just because the words mean different things in the different contexts. And I did read some articles about the difference between allocating on stack and heap. Didn't understand it. Read it again 9 months later. Didn't understand it. Read it again a few months after that, and then it clicked. Then I really understood what was going on, and I can build from that knowledge. So it kind of, there's an issue where even if an instructor has taken a piece of information or a subject and organized it into a linear classroom flow. If you miss an earlier piece just because your brain isn't ready, then the rest of the class is kind of not so useful.
That's an interesting perspective. I guess I hadn't thought about that, but that's definitely true in math. For instance, if you are trying to solve a differential equation or something, and you missed 2 or 3 techniques earlier, not because the professor didn't speak about it, but perhaps because he or she you weren't ready to listen to it, like you said. And I guess I never thought about it like that because
it didn't click, it didn't mesh in with your existing body of knowledge, and so there isn't a really good way that you remember it or understand what it's trying to tell you.
I wonder if there's. Sorry, here I am wondering out loud on our podcast. So here comes the brain dump. I'm actually curious now because I very much enjoyed the classroom experience, coming through college and grad school because of the organization. But I definitely found that once I hit graduate school, I didn't find that it was as easy to jump in and understand what was going on. And I think partly because I had been spoon-fed the answers through these very, neatly packaged solutions all the way through my undergraduate education, ironically in math and physics, just like you. And I had to get to graduate school and face some really tough problems to actually back up and start asking, well, how do you think? How do you learn? How do you solve a problem? And I think even in graduate school, I didn't have a structure for how to think that through. I kind of made it through by accident because I just kept trying, I guess. But
well, and many people with the certificate have that experience. Is they didn't really take a lot of time. The classroom almost, with its deadlines and schedules, it doesn't give you the time to really deeply reflect and internalize the knowledge you're being fed. And I don't put a lot of stock into the certificate for precisely this reason. People went through and they answered the questions, but they didn't. The fact that they have a paper doesn't mean they thought about it at night and internalized it.
So do you have experience that tells you this? Like, have you worked with people that have the paper and some are problem solvers and some aren't?
I have the opposite experience, where people that don't have the paper are really good at solving problems.
That was not what I expected you to say. So let's flip that back around then. So the people that didn't have the paper, that do have the solutions, know how to solve. Has this been in your programming experience or?
Oh yeah.
And where did they get their knowledge from?
A lot of times they're self-taught. And as a graduate student, I met students that were completely self-taught and obviously bored with the curriculum. I could tell by reading the assignments that they turned in. They're clearly just better at this than all the other students. And really, it's because they've been doing it longer.
Huh. So let's shift and go more to the philosophical side then. The other question we like to answer. Let me back up. I'm not sure you actually answered what does it mean to be educated? So I'm going to ask you again to summarize that. What in this digital age where we have all these tools now, what does that mean to be educated?
So I think to be you can hold a body of knowledge in your head, right, and have no certificate verifying or just claiming that you know it, and still consider yourself very, very educated. So you can just read a bunch of stuff online, and for any topic really, you can get all the material online that you need to be a local expert within a month. You just study it at night a couple hours, and then a month later you're the local expert on that topic. You want to be a world expert? It takes a little bit longer, but the material's there. Unless you need like peer review research papers that you have to buy, the material's there. And so being educated to me means that you have this body of knowledge in your head, and you're able to apply it to solve problems in that field.
All right, so I'm going to actually ask you to expand on that just a little bit, because you're mostly talking about reading something somewhere, but then you said at the end
you have to apply it.
It. So does that application have anything to do with the process of being educated?
It certainly does, and it has to do with the whole internalizing the knowledge. So there are some fields that'll be fairly theoretic, let's take theoretical physics, right? It's the most theoretic thing you could do. There aren't any experiments that we can do to say whether or not the world is one way or another because the equipment is so expensive.
Mm-hmm.
The particle detectors and whatnot, they're just too big to build.
Yeah.
But as you're learning that as a theoretical physicist, you're toying around with the mathematical models. You're doing a lot of play with the math models, and that's it's a kind of interaction. It's a very intellectual interaction with a book and a paper, but it is an interaction. Mm-hmm. And you really just don't understand the field if you don't do that. You don't pick up a book and read it and then fall asleep. You pick up the book and you solve the equations. You go through the exercises.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly true whether you're talking about theoretic physics or anything else. I mean, you have to. I mean,
I pick on theoretical physics because that's one where it's not as obvious.
It isn't as obvious, but I will. Well, you and I both know we've
Yeah.
done a little bit of physics. I mean, there's no matter how theoretic it is, you have to look at the concept, which is typically a string of words or an idea out of someone's head. And typically, the way we approach solving or getting a deeper understanding of that is to turn that idea into math, and that requires putting pen to paper, and that is the act, in my opinion, of beginning to apply the knowledge. Although, even if you read, another possibility is doing, sort of the Einstein-Gedanken experiments kind of thing, where you think through the experiment in your head, even though, and that isn't, reading and assimilating knowledge either. That's taking the knowledge somehow and doing some sort of mental gyration. It's still applying the knowledge, and even if it's all in your head.
Oh yeah. So Einstein had encountered some concepts, and then he thought, well, how far can we push them? And he thought in his head these Gedanken experiments, and then he mathematized what he was saying.
So if you put that in a very neat little package, then to be educated is...
It's really to have knowledge and then be able to apply it.
All right, so with that, then let's jump into the last question, which is, what is the purpose of an education? And that kind of delves into your philosophical, ideological perspective of life. Why do we educate?
So
what is the purpose?
I think having a systematized version of education, like we have in America with the grade school, and middle school, and high school, is completely ridiculous. But on a number of levels. One is, if your child missed kindergarten, would they not know their colors? Because I'm pretty sure they're going to know their colors. They're just going to assimilate it from the rest of the culture. They're probably, even if you didn't have a class, they're probably going to learn to read. Why? So that they can get along in the culture. Just so that they can read a menu at a restaurant, or probably so they can text their friends. Right? They want to communicate. And if learning how to read is the way to do it, then they will reach an age at which they're suddenly motivated now to learn how to do that thing. And I think our education system is severely broken by the assumption that everybody's learning at the same rate, that they're learning the same concepts at the same time, and that they're learning them in a certain order. It's just all ridiculous. Because people aren't ready at the same age to learn the same thing. They lag. Some people sprint in some subject and lag in the others. And which subject it's going to be varies by the kid. And so it's much better to have, say, a skills-based education, where the child's able to choose what it is they're interested in, and then learn those things. And because they're interested in doing it, you automatically are going to have much higher engagement in the classroom, because they want to be there. They want to learn whatever it is you're saying. And maybe they're 12, maybe they're much older. I don't know. You just wait for them to want that knowledge.
All right, so we could probably keep going. We probably shouldn't. But can you take all those ideas about what is the purpose of an education? Can you boil that down to a sentence or two?
So I would say that it's hard to say what the purpose of education is.
And by education, I don't always mean the formalized,
sure. But
education system, but like why do we educate ourselves as humans?
One could just be intrinsic curiosity, and another could be extrinsically, I want to make my life better by solving the problems that I face today. And that could be problems you have personally, or it could be problems that other people are experiencing and you want to help out. But if you don't have the knowledge, if you don't have the education, it's hard to solve problems.
All right. Let's wrap it right there. Eric, that was a lot of fun. If people on our podcast are interested to connect with you or learn more about what you do, what's the best way for them to do that?
That would probably be through mail, through email. So I can be reached at eric.hennigan@gmail.com.
Why don't you spell that? Because I'm in the habit of not putting that on our
Oh, you don't
on our
have
website.
show notes?
Well, I do have show notes, but I don't typically put email addresses because of, I don't know.
Oh, spam bots.
Spam
Yeah.
bots. But you work at Google. We have Gmail. That most spam doesn't exist because Google is awesome. Thank you,
Right.
Google.
We're happy to provide some products for free. We make a lot of money on the ads. It's wonderful.
So spell out your email address so that our listeners can find you if they're interested.
Yeah,
Ask you more questions.
So that's Eric, ERIC, Hennigan, HENNIGAN, @gmail.com.
Perfect. Thank you, Eric.
I'm glad to be on the show.
Every time I talk to Eric, I learn something new. He's just full of excellent insights and thinks deeply about life and learning. So keep listening at the end of this episode for a few more minutes of discussion between me and Eric. For the last month or two, we've been talking about our Resonance Innovation Fellowship here at the end of the podcast, but we're closing registration on that soon. However, if you have students destined to be a programmer or engineer like Eric, stop by the Tabletop Inventing website at ttinvent.com and learn more about the Inventor Camp coming this summer. Inventor Camp is not your typical summer camp. Students actually learn more in 4 days at camp than in weeks during school, but they don't even know they're learning because it's so much fun. To learn more about Inventor Camp, go to ttinvent.com. And remember, the future can always be read by those who create it.
And in computer, well, in the whole computer field, there's a very strong emphasis when you go to get a job, you do an interview. And the interviews, they can do a phone screen first, and then there's whiteboarding. And they'll ask you some silly problem. And there's constraints on what problems they can ask, because you have to answer like within an hour. And it has to be something that you can reasonably get and then provide a solution for within an hour. So they're not hard problems. They're not like, can you build me a search engine? Because that was more than in 1 hour's labor, I can assure you. They're not like, write me a compiler, because that's many hours labor. But they're sort of trivial problems, and they're really just to gauge whether or not you have, on the one hand, knowledge, that you've just encountered these concepts before. On the other hand, that you can explain them to the interviewer, and the explanation proves that you were able to apply the knowledge.
So I'm going to push back just a little bit, because you said that to be educated is to, and I'm going to paraphrase, to have a body of knowledge and then to be able to apply it. I guess what we do here at Tabletop Inventing, thinking this through, is we have a fundamental belief that part of the education process isn't that you're able to apply it, but you apply it, and that is the process of learning.
Oh, I definitely agree that you don't learn much without application.
All right. So
Definitely
we
agree there.
Just so we're on
Yeah.
the same page. All right. So
And that totally meshes with my experience. I remember being a teenager is a profoundly long period of identity crisis.
But in the classical education, around the age of 12 or 13, you shift from putting knowledge in to taking that knowledge and applying it, exactly what you're talking about. And there's certainly a lot of people that would say that process needs to be structured in some way. And you're saying that maybe that's not as necessary to be structured, or what are you saying exactly?
Well, I'm saying it doesn't have to be scheduled. You could still, so for example, you can have people who have structured approaches to certain subjects. So you can find podcasts that are in like American history, and that means some educator, whether they're calling themselves that or not, they just care about the topic and explaining it. So they're an educator. Has arranged a series step-by-step things that you can go through. And if that's what interests you, you can find any number of these people that have such arrangements and find one that you enjoy and learn from it. So there is structure there, but it's not the kind of ham-handed, everybody does it the same way structure. It's a lot looser.
All right, so let me play devil's advocate here again and ask a different kind of question. How do you think about the idea of for the veracity of information? Do you worry about that as much in a situation where the education maybe isn't scheduled or is less formalized?
Well, at Google, all of the engineers are really quite comfortable with, we're just starting some project, or I've just joined a project and I have no idea what's going on. And that's it's uncomfortable, but it's totally expected. Everybody recognizes that you feel uncomfortable and it takes a while to get your feet on the ground again. And it's expected that you do this, or it's expected that you're able to deal with that kind of discomfort.
So when you go looking for a piece of information, let's say the internet, for instance, let's say we Google something just because we can, and some information comes up. How do you know if that information is valid or not? Let's say, for instance, it's history, because that's probably the quintessential difficult thing to prove its veracity. Like, how do you know, and how do you deal with that then in a situation where your education isn't formalized or set up in some way where someone has had to vet the information?
Yeah, so in that case, it's a little bit difficult. The self-educator can fall into a kind of a trap where they're only reading about things that they already agree with. And that might be completely non-mainstream ideas, right? They just have this one particular belief about how the world is, and then they read only articles that speak to that. Self-educators can totally fall into that trap. And I'm not the kind of person to go around and saying that they should be kicked out of it. Even though I think that, I'm not. I'm going to try calmly to introduce them to other ideas. And anyone who's lived long enough has probably just changed their viewpoint in some way, where they flipped on some kind of what they thought was a very fundamental question in their own personal belief system. And it's a result of they reach a point where they're comfortable changing that idea. They've found enough other things on the other side where they can comfortably pivot. And it's wonderful that we're able to share all these different ideas in an unstructured way so that people can at least encounter information that's contrary to their own beliefs.
All right, so we should probably wrap this up, but I can't help one last question. In this environment, how do you keep from falling into that trap of only reading things you agree with?
Well, I've already fallen into that trap on several occasions. But I've been very fortunate that I'll have a friend or somebody else who I agree with about most things, but then I have some small disagreement about some other thing. And it's the very fact that we disagree about some small thing, we're all and our willingness to be friends about so many other things that I'm willing to actually go through and look that thing up. And I have changed my ideas for exactly this reason. Some friend has introduced me to an alternative way, and then I've gone and read a bunch of articles on it.
So that sounds like, well, I can't help thinking about the social aspect of education, because certainly Dewey and Piaget probably would have something to say about that, about social learning theory. Because what you just described was this idea that by interacting with another human being, they've changed the trajectory of the kinds of things you learned and why you choose to learn them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Education is really about sharing ideas.